Welcome everyone to this discussion of the application scale of LANDFIRE products, and I want to add my personal thanks to everyone for your time and participation. And I'm going to try not to use jargon, but this topic of data accuracy and usability has been a personal interest of mine for more than 30 years. If I do fall into that jargon trap, then I hope you'll stop me and also ask any clarifying questions as we go along. However, if it's a discussion question, please hold it to the end so we'll have adequate time to try to address it. Our goal today is simply to clarify and expand your understanding about the application of LANDFIRE products and tell you where to get some assistance from the LANDFIRE program to find helpful documents or materials or tools that will help you utilize LANDFIRE products when appropriate in the appropriate way. Now, this presentation is necessarily brief to accommodate the time available within the call. The topic is complex, and thus our discussion today is going to be somewhat superficial. We can certainly have a more detailed discussion in the future, perhaps in an individual or interactive manner to facilitate greater understanding on a specific landscape or in a specific type of application. So just let us know what we can do to try to help you. Now, this presentation, of course, was requested, but it's really prompted by questions that you receive and certainly that the LANDFIRE program has received frequently since day one, the delivery of the first product in effect. Questions like, what is the appropriate scale to use LANDFIRE, and can I or should I use LANDFIRE data on my landscape? Well, we're not going to be able to answer all those questions in 30 minutes, but I am hopeful that we can get down the road a little bit further because we don't want to miss a great application. We want to support every useful and appropriate application of LANDFIRE, but we don't want to encourage a single inappropriate utilization of LANDFIRE either. And the key to achieving that goal is knowledge. You know, we have to balance these desire to support good applications and discourage bad applications through communication and knowledge. And we're committed to providing everything that we know to users. So what do we mean by scale? Well, I think that's the first ultimate definition that we need to get out so that everyone is thinking the same thing as we discuss this. Well, we don't mean spatial resolution, and oftentimes people confuse those things. The spatial resolution of LANDFIRE is a 30-meter raster cell. But we do not recommend using individual pixels in LANDFIRE. It's inappropriate use of LANDFIRE products. So we don't mean spatial resolution. We don't mean the same thing as historic scale of an aerial photograph or a printed map, which basically is defined as the numerical relationship between distances on some product like a photo or a map and those same distances on the ground, that ratio of distances. That's not what we mean either. As we hear the question most often these days, scale really refers to the specific geography over which the data can be appropriately applied. Okay? And what that means is it can be applied in effect without significant adjustment. You can use data on anything that you want, but the expectation of using that data as it is, as it comes out of the box, is what people are really asking about. Should I be able to use LANDFIRE data as delivered on my geography without needing to adjust it? Now note that all data sets have an implied application scale. That is, not just LANDFIRE and not just in LCD, not just national data sets, but also local and regional data sets. You know, all data sets lose their fidelity. They lose their usability at some point as you zoom in or as you zoom out. They might become incomplete. So you need to remember that this is not just a LANDFIRE question. It's not just a question about national data sets. It's a question about every data set. What is the application scale? So in that sense of application scale, LANDFIRE is expected to be a national, regional, or very large landscape scale data set. You should be able to use LANDFIRE data out of the box as delivered on very large landscapes, on regions, at a national scale, without having to adjust it or edit it significantly, and still get a usable answer. So this application scale that we just described is defined by how that data was created, the specific mapping methods that were used, and how much and what kind of supporting data was available, how much time and how much money did we have to actually create those products. All these things combine to create the application scale of any data set. So how would I define it a little bit better than the generalities that we've been talking about? Well, I would say that the patterns on the landscape, when viewed or analyzed at the national, regional, or large landscape level, are expected to represent reality sufficiently well to use the data with little or no revision. Now, it may sound a little wishy-washy, but it's not, and it's not prevarication. That is the reality of the mapping. Don't zoom or subset beyond what we've just described without expecting to make revisions. If you do, you're no longer analyzing or viewing at the intended scale. Now, it doesn't mean it's never good for smaller geographies or always good for larger geographies. We're really kind of talking a probability scale here. The larger the geography, the more mappable the geography, the more likely it is LANDFIRE products can be used out of the box as delivered. The smaller the geography, the lower the probability that LANDFIRE products could be used out of the box as delivered without making adjustments. My sort of favorite metaphor here is impressionistic paintings. You know, if you stand too close to an impressionist painting, a Turner or a Monet, then you can't see the patterns that the painter was actually trying to convey. But as you step back, you get to a point where all those patterns start to coalesce. The painting is evocative. The painting tells the story that you intended to tell. And I think raster or all data sets are the same way. You can be too far in or you can be too far out. So let's try to define these terms: national, regional, very large landscape, scale, a little bit better. And I'm going to use real examples to sort of describe what these terms mean as best I can. But you're going to find that they're not explicitly definable. And we'll talk about that as we go along. So national scale is probably the easiest. It means the entire U.S. It could mean continental U.S. Very, very large regions. The example I'm going to use is the National Carbon and Biomass Dataset, which was developed by the Woods Hole Research Institute. And this is an effective example of a national application because the goal was to create a publicly available national baseline data set, very similar in concept to LANDFIRE, except their focus was on carbon stocks and biomass. Now, if you want to learn more about this application and the others that I'm going to describe today, I'm going to direct you to what we call the LANDFIRE Web Hosted Applications Map, or WHAM. And each one of these orange balloons that you see here represents some application in some area and at many different application scales. And to really understand this application and the others, if you'll click on that balloon, you'll see a dialog box will open up that includes a short description of the application and link and a photograph. And this is where you'll go to really delve into these applications and their scale and what they found in more detail. So you'll find the link. We'll find the link to this a little bit later in the presentation. So to find out more about the National Carbon and Biomass Dataset, then you'll click on the balloon there in coastal Massachusetts where the Woods Hole Institute is located. Now, what does regional mean? Well, regional means some significant portion of the country, or sometimes states. And maybe not eastern states. And so you can see we're even running into problems with language and definitiveness of the language, even at something like regional. You know, regions and political units vary greatly in size. You know, the Pacific Northwest is not the same as the coastal Southeast, you know, in terms of area or complexity, but yet we would think of those all as significant regions. Most western counties, or many western counties anyway, are larger than entire eastern states. So it's not as easy to define this as you may think, just sort of on the surface. So what do we mean? Well, here's an example. Assessing ecosystem services in the Midwest. Now, this is a regional application because its geographic focus and scope was on the Midwest agricultural states and the development of a comprehensive spatial database to assess ecosystem services. So again, you're thinking multi-states here, a significant or large portion of the country. In some places that may be a state, but not everywhere is it a state. So here we look at the web-hosted applications map again, the WAM. And if you select this balloon in Iowa, you'll learn a little bit more about this particular application, which we suggest is an example of a good regional application. It's not the only one here, so you can certainly find others if you explore the web-hosted applications map. So now large landscaping, and it's getting even more difficult to precisely define application scale as we talk about large landscapes. But let's just sort of define it as best we can as an area of significant size and biological, ecological diversity. But this language is really a proxy for what we want. A large sample of pixels that represent a variety of conditions. Well, how large? Well, I generally tell people hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pixels. Now, each pixel is 30 meters by 30 meters, or about 0.2 acres. So this translates to many tens of thousands of acres. Again, if you plan to use LANDFIRE spatial data without making significant modifications to improve local accuracy of the product. And let me say again, we're talking probabilities here, because the mapping conditions vary across the country so much that what we're saying here is that the larger the landscape, the more likely it is LANDFIRE data is going to represent the local nature of that landscape effectively. The smaller it is, the less likely. Okay? Because it may not look like it, but mapping really is just statistics. It's sort of like polling. You know, like a statewide political poll, it may not represent your particular neighborhood very well at all. Your beliefs may be quite different, but it may be a good representation for a much larger area. So I think you need to think of large landscape as hundreds of thousands or millions of samples, depending on the mappability of the vegetation targets and how much data was used to actually create those products, to support the development of that product. Now, these are fundamental mapping constraints that LANDFIRE and other programs must deal with. The conditions are not the same everywhere, so I cannot give you a specific number such as 10,000 acres or 50,000 acres or 100,000 acres. It depends on your particular situation and what product you're going to use and for what. I could take you to 2,000 or 3,000 acre parcels near where I live here in Florida that are mapped beautifully by LANDFIRE. And I'm sure we could find 100,000 acre parcel somewhere that's not mapped particularly well by LANDFIRE. So there is no specific answer, but think in terms of probabilities and think in terms of samples. So an example of a large landscape scale application is one that I've highlighted here. This is a fuel treatment assessment in Southern California. So if you sort of select this further inland point, orange balloon, on the web-hosted applications map here in coastal California, you'll get a lot more information about a very large landscape. And again, thinking samples and thinking probabilities. So why does it matter how large an area of interest is? Well, let me demonstrate on a real national wildlife refuge and ask the question, what happens to data when you zoom in? Well, the truth is nothing happens to the data, but what the user can see does change as you zoom in. And remember my impressionist painting metaphor. So let's take a look at the Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge. And this data patch that you see here that I downloaded, this is LANDFIRE existing vegetation type from the LANDFIRE version 1.1, or what we call refresh. I downloaded this because we got some questions about the data from this particular unit in the National Wildlife Refuge system. And it's a 50,000 acre parcel in the middle of the data set. And clearly, I think you can see at this scale, quote, application scale, and this display scale, which is about 1 to 500,000, you can see the National Wildlife Refuge and how it stands out from its background. It's about a 50,000 acre parcel, here amidst somewhere in the neighborhood of a 1.5 to 2 million acre patch. You can see how it fits into the landscape. You can see the southern end is different from the northern end. The patterns are probably correct. You're not really focusing on the small details. But let's zoom in at 1 to 250,000 display scale. And your view is still viewing several 100,000 acres. And again, I think you can see the patterns on the landscape. You can see how the National Wildlife Refuge stands out against the background of the surrounding landscape. Some details are beginning to come visible, such as roads and individual patches within the National Wildlife Refuge. You can see what are probable agricultural areas and how they run up the drains and draws and things like that. But now let's zoom into 1 to 50,000 scale. And here we're only looking at around, 30 to 40,000 acres. Now you begin to see some of the issues with raw raster data and begin to focus on individual pixels or small groups of pixels. Patterns begin to be more difficult to see and discern. LANDFIRE was not really designed to be viewed or analyzed at this scale. And that may be all right. If you're lucky, it may be all right. But that should not be your assumption. And I would call this a local application scale. So let's take a look at 2 additional local or small scale applications. So let's first take a look at the Mount Grant or Hawthorne Army Depot application in Nevada. So back to the WAM again. Select the Mount Grant Hawthorne bullet. Again, you'll find a link and a photograph. And here the answer of the applicability of LANDFIRE products out of the box is mixed. LANDFIRE vegetation models were used. They had to be modified, but they were used in the project. But the LANDFIRE produced current and potential vegetation types. Now, this would have been in the original LANDFIRE version, LANDFIRE National. They were not sufficiently accurate to support the planned analysis. So they got experts together. They looked at the data and they said, this just is not good enough for us to use. Why? Well, partly because of the size. Although the Wasatch Range is around 300,000 acres, of which this is a part, the total area of this analysis was quite a bit smaller. You should not assume that LANDFIRE's spatial products will be useful without review or revision on this size area. That should not be your assumption. But I'm not sure the answer would have been different on a much larger area here. And why is that? Well, because look at the photograph. The vegetation is rarely sparse. That's almost always a difficult mapping task, especially from satellite imagery. There's a predominance of shrub types, some kind of sagebrush. Again, a more difficult mapping task. There was pinyon juniper encroachment on sagebrush, which complicated the mapping of the potential vegetation. Cheatgrass is invaded, and even relatively low amounts are important, that is, amounts that are not detectable on satellite imagery. It's beyond LANDFIRE's ability to map 5 to 10% invasion of cheatgrass consistently and accurately. So importantly, on all these things that I just talked about, these problems were compounded because there were very few ground plots available to drive the classifier in this geography. So all in all, this was just a difficult to map vegetation situation, and that is what they found. The products were just not viable out of the box for them to use for this particular application, although they did use the vegetation models. However, just a few hundred miles to the east-northeast at the Grouse Creek Raft River Mountains in Utah, LANDFIRE products needed very little revision on the Grouse Creek Raft River Mountains project in northwest Utah. Why were the products more useful here for this group? And again, this is a locally derived decision, not a LANDFIRE decision. Well, it's a slightly larger area of interest for one thing. Again, improving the odds that LANDFIRE data is useful as delivered. Remember the concept of sample size, improving the odds. But probably more importantly, there's a different set of vegetation types here that are a bit more mappable. Some aspen conifer forest versus shrub and herbaceous, a little bit less shrub and herbaceous, which typically do tend to be the more difficult mapping task. But the key result here is that we know that there were a lot of plots in this area that could be used to drive the classifier. And that almost always is the key issue. Sometimes the classifier is just overwhelmed by the difficulty of the mapping task, even when there are a lot of plots. But that happens a lot less often when there are sufficient plots to drive the classifier. And again, remember that these conclusions about the applicability of LANDFIRE data were developed by local experts, by local stakeholders. They're not LANDFIRE decisions. What we want to do is to support this kind of review at the local level when individuals or organizations are interested in applying LANDFIRE data. And to do so, we've developed some resources online to help with this. We'll talk about some more in a moment. So what is the application of LANDFIRE spatial products? Well, unfortunately, and perhaps frustrating to you and others, there is no single synoptic answer to this question. There is no answer to the question of the appropriateness of LANDFIRE program products out of the box for everyone, everywhere, for everything. It does depend on what product you're going to use, where you are, and what you're going to do. If you need more general information, LANDFIRE may fit well even on small geographies out of the box. If you need very detailed information, it may not. Depends on what product you're going to use. Fire behavior fuel models versus existing vegetation type or existing vegetation height or cover. So it's not a LANDFIRE defined answer to this question. There isn't one. There isn't one number that fits everyone, everywhere, for everything. So how do you decide? Well, the first thing the local group needs to do is to understand what you need from the data set and why you need that. How are you going to use that data? And what are the really important characteristics of that data? For instance, if identifying 5 to 10% coverage of cheatgrass is important to you, you should expect that LANDFIRE will not meet your needs out of the box without adjustment. If you need to separate many, many different types of grasses or several different types of shrub, LANDFIRE may not meet your needs. So what do you need and why do you need it? So then you work with those local stakeholders to review the data, keeping your requirements in mind. You know, data often doesn't have to be perfect to be useful. But only a local group can determine that usefulness when they view the data and have their needs and requirements in mind. Then we ask the question, if there are significant issues after review, will it be more efficient, financially and temporally to create new data or modify LANDFIRE? How close is the LANDFIRE product to what you need? And is there an opportunity to modify it so it meets your needs? Again, a local decision. LANDFIRE cannot make that decision for you. If you decide to edit LANDFIRE data, there are videos and documents to tell you how to review and how to edit data. They are online and they are available for you for downloading or viewing online. So let's just go over a couple of things for you, where you can find some of this supporting material. Well, there's landfire.gov. This is the official program website, and if you'll look under the Science and Application Library, you'll find sections on data quality and data use. Under the data quality section, you'll know what we know, at least that we've been allowed to publish online. Sometimes people don't want their results published online, and we won't. Everything we know about accuracy is available there. Data use, well, there are descriptions of real applications of LANDFIRE products in the data use library, which may be helpful to you because looking at other people's successes and non-successes or failures may help you understand if and how LANDFIRE products might be useful for you or appropriate for your application. So here is the web-hosted applications map, and this is the URL for it, maps.tnc.org/landfire. So nothing really speaks to users like real applications, so I encourage you to visit the WAM and to investigate these different applications for yourself and go into the amount of detail that you want to about specific applications. There's a ton of information here that will help you understand where other people have succeeded and not succeeded with LANDFIRE products. And there are both in here, as I mentioned with the Mount Grant. It's not all good news. We want to tell you everything we know and make sure that you're fully informed. So go to this web-hosted applications map and investigate some of these applications. So here's a shortened URL for what we call the Conservation Gateway, which is the TNC Science website. And LANDFIRE has a large presence on this site, including support and applications sections. Now in this applications section, you'll find descriptions of many other applications of LANDFIRE products. And there's some, but it's a minor overlap with what you'll find on landfire.gov. So you can go here and expect to see many different things in many different applications. A lot of these applications, however, are on the web-hosted applications map. So I hope you'll go there and use that as a starting point for looking at these other applications. In the support section, you're going to find different kinds of materials and links to other resources that are available to you. So this is a more traditional support section which will provide background information and helpful tools and information for you. One example of what we have available are videos and how-to guides. So we created several instructional documents with accompanying videos to help you understand and use LANDFIRE data appropriately and efficiently. And we call these how-to user guides, and sort of jokingly we call them hugs, and we'd like to give you a hug. Now highlighted in here on the Conservation Gateway, a particular hug that's called Reviewing and Modifying LANDFIRE Spatial Data. But there are others. But if you are considering the use of LANDFIRE spatial products, you should at least, I think, review this hug and the accompanying videos, which I think will help set you up for understanding and reviewing the LANDFIRE products so that you can either decide to use them appropriately or decide to move on to some other data set. Now there are other online resources as well. Social media that we've set up, Twitter, where we have discussions with users and we post news and updates, and we pose interesting questions sometimes to users, and then we answer sometimes questions from users. And you see here there are more than 650 followers of the LANDFIRE site on Twitter. There's a LANDFIRE YouTube channel. It contains about 30 videos that will help you understand LANDFIRE products and what LANDFIRE plans are and the methods that we use to create the data. There are some very helpful supporting instructional videos here, so if you have questions, I hope you'll check this out. And don't forget there are 2 LANDFIRE email-based help desks. And there are also tool descriptions on the nifty.gov website. There's so many resources online to help you, but if those don't answer the questions, if they don't help you, then please feel free to contact anyone on the team if you need additional help and need additional information. So here are the take-home messages. Application scale means geography. What geography can the data be used on without expecting revision or adjustment? But all data should be reviewed for appropriateness, no matter what. Your data, somebody else's data, LANDFIRE data, other data products, whatever, they should all always be reviewed for appropriateness. Think of landscape scale like sample size. The larger and more representative the number of pixels that we have, the more likely the resulting spatial data will be accurate enough to use out of the box. And we're talking probabilities here. We're talking statistics. The likelihood that the data is useful to you goes up or down depending on a lot of factors. Out of the box, LANDFIRE data will generally, we think, be usable for national, regional, and very large landscape scale applications. And by landscape scale, we mean hundreds of thousands or millions of pixels. That means many, many tens of thousands of acres. But unfortunately, it does vary. There is no specific answer to this. There is no guarantee because the situation varies across the country. What are you trying to map? What are you trying to use? What product is going to be selected? So it's really only you that can answer the application scale question with sufficient certainty. But we can either help you personally or by providing information online for you to use. Thanks for your time.